the discussion I want to have during this panel is to continue to ask the question about the connection between doctrinal foundational truths with a practical ministry, and to talk about how we go about doing that, to talk about a theological vision, to talk about what it means to have all of our life and ministry shaped by the gospel. So we're going to talk about issues related to contextualization, possibly cultural engagement, and missional living. So also, they've also informed me that if you're interested in buying Center Church, then you can go down to the bookstore downstairs after this session and speak with the folks there from City to City or Zondervan. Okay, well, maybe I'll just kind of throw it out here. Tim, you've been working on this Center Church book for many years now. I think that we would consider this your magnum opus. Not that your other books were not that influential, but this is essentially your kind of your understanding of everything that you do. And so, can you just again touch upon this language that you use, which you have borrowed? Even Rick has in his book Fabric of Theology, talking about this theological vision. Can you tell us a little bit more about the language you use in terms of doctrinal foundation of hardware and software, in terms of practical ministry, and this middleware that you call, or what Rick will call, theological vision, and how the gospel shapes everything that we do? Can you just kind of get us started?
So the others were just opus. Is that it?
Right, not magnum.
Okay, no, never mind. Yeah. I'll be brief because after all, I just spoke for an hour. But Stephen's right. The idea of the theological vision that I develop in the introduction to set up the rest of the book comes from Rick's book, Fabric of Theology. I'm not sure I'm not actually sure whether very often if you ever see your own ideas redescribed in somebody else's book, it never quite sounds exactly like what you meant, so I don't know how close or far I am. But I do know that the idea that Rick gave in that book was that you have your doctrinal foundation, and yet it's so obvious that when you move into a new culture, you have some decisions to make. On the basis of that, the new culture, some of it's right, some of it has to be rejected, some of it can be embraced because it's indifferent, perhaps, or some of it needs to be repurposed. And so I began to realize in my own denomination, for example, that I had a number of people who all believed in the Westminster standards and we had the same doctrinal foundation, yet the way we were doing ministry was not only very, very different, but we were hostile to each other about it. And Rick's book helped me understand that, because I realized that most of us do not do theological reflection on our culture. You have to take your doctrinal foundations, what you believe, and then use it as you think very carefully about your culture, to know how to relate to it. Most of us tend to just pick up programs, ministry programs that we read in books, and we just say, oh, that'll work, I think. Without much reflection, we jump from our doctrinal foundation to programs, because we pick up, if pastors pick up all these books saying, here's how to do small groups, here's how to do worship, we tend to make our decisions viscerally, sort of like my temperament likes that, or maybe I used to live in Alabama, now I live in New England, and all I know is in Alabama, that's how I did it, so I just start doing it here without any thinking about the difference of culture. I realized that was the missing piece. It was theological reflection on culture that needs to happen. I mean, I'm not leaving my doctrinal foundations. I'm using the doctrinal foundations as a way to do the theological reflection, but that instead of just jumping up to programs, I need to do deeper reflection. And it also helped me understand that the reason why in my denomination we have such different views is because people actually have come up with pretty different theological visions, and they've come to different conclusions about the culture. And not only culture, because Rick points out, it's also not the culture is the present, the past is your tradition. We also have different views of what part of tradition fits today and what does not. So it just opened my mind to it. But of course, Rick was writing a theology book, not a practical ministry book, so I felt over the years I wanted to apply it. So the Center Church comes from many, many years of thinking out the implications of the insight I got when I read Rick's book in early 90s, right? 92 or something like that.
Yeah, I forgot to set the ground rules for this panel.
Rules?
Yeah, some rules, not universal rules, David. But I was taught that the best moderators are the ones that just kind of get out of the way. They don't impose their position during any particular panel. But
you're not going to do
that. I won't make any comments there. But Rick and David, please feel free, and Tim, just to interact with one another if you want to follow up, if you want clarification, and so on. Rick, would you like to possibly
I think
respond?
Tim's point, it's often hard to explain why Christians who agree on so much seem to disagree so often. And it's not uncommon, it's not unusual to our age. There are peculiar ways, I think, that we become partisans often of ourselves. There's this grand rivalry, used to be anyway, between Boston and New York. We all participate in these rivalries, and we carry it over. So there is something unique to our age. But of course, as a colleague of mine says, every letter in the New Testament is written to a church in conflict. Conflict among us is not unusual. And so thinking outside the box of our differences strikes me as pretty important to ask why it is that we seem to agree on so much and disagree so much as well. The mythologies, the stories that we purchase inevitably from our times influence those partisan loyalties. And getting at those myths is only shattered by understanding the biblical mythology, the story, this grand epic. And so the point often is how much richer, thicker, more interesting is the biblical story than our stories, and ways in which it comes into conflict. We're always much better, though, I think, in seeing somebody else's mythologies than we are seeing our own mythologies.
Yeah, Tim, it was helpful when you share that when you're speaking about some sort of biblical truth, that you need to understand that it's being received and stated in a particular social or cultural location. And Dick Kaufman, who's a friend of some of us, asks church planners this question: how are you and your setting unlike the church model you admire the most? Would you be able to kind of speak into that? He's talking about issues of contextualization, how we often tend to want to produce a particular ministry or a church shaped by what we admire or what we feel most comfortable with, and therefore giving contextualization and demonizing the word contextualization, whereas you would argue that we're doing contextualization whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is whether it's good contextualization or poor contextualization. But what do you think about Dick Kaufman? How are you and your setting unlike the church model you admire the most?
Are you asking all of us?
Yeah, anyone.
I mean, I think the problem before the solution is how is it that we hold on to context, hold on to strategies to deal with our context, which aren't in fact informed from a voice outside of that context, but by our own intuitions. And we're not very good at reading ourselves, it strikes me. I don't think that's unusual. I think that's part of the dysfunctional brokenness of our sin, that we tend to root for ourselves rather than against ourselves. We justify ourselves. This is part of the language of religion. That's what we do well. We justify ourselves. And so bumping up against those who challenge us. I'm reminded of Luther's words, the scriptures always must come to us as an adversary. rather than as a friend in the first instance. And in that regard, we're so clear about how the Scriptures cut against somebody else. We're not so clear how it cuts against us. I mean, you've made the same point, David, in the way in which we evangelicals celebrate being people of the book that are nonetheless fascinated with everything but the book in many ways.
Well, I do think Tim started out with a very significant issue, and I'd like to just pick up on it and what you've just said. If we could just stand back a little bit of distance between ourselves and particular ministries in which we may be engaged, and just look at the big picture for a minute. Because we're all part of what's happening, we don't always catch on to what's happening. It's the frog in the pot, slowly boiling. But we're right in the midst of a most astounding change here in the West, as Christianity, statistically speaking, is disappearing in an astounding way. Least so in the US, far more so in continental Europe and Canada, Australia, where next Sunday 2% will go to any kind of church at all. They're just vast stretches of continental Europe, where the only remnant of Christianity is an empty cathedral. And as we all know, the statistical center of gravity of Christian faith has moved south. And in other parts of the world, there is a great deal of Christian believing going on. In Africa, where I go a lot, in Zambia next Sunday, there'll be about 80% that'll be in church. Now, this has all happened in a very short period of time. And it would be good for those of us who live in North America to ask ourselves the question whether we understand what's happening. Now, this is a very complex question, and obviously we can't resolve it here. But I think the smallest conclusion that you can draw would be that this highly modernized context in which we live is obviously, it has become very inhospitable to Christian faith. It was a point Tim was making a little earlier on. And therefore, when we start to do ministry, it's terribly important for us to try to understand exactly why that is and what is going on in people's minds. Because the fact is that Christian faith at its very heart is both world-affirming and world-denying. It is always yes and no. It is against the world because it's for the world. It has just a peerless record when it comes to human rights, building schools, universities, orphanages, all of those kinds of things. It is a marvelous history. But it has not, in recent years, in my judgment, had such a good record, at least here in the West, in knowing what it can take on board and what, with some courage, it needs to say no to. And that becomes a very, very important issue when you are engaged in ministry.
Yeah, and I think that's very helpful, David. That's why this having a healthy, balanced, contextual way of looking, exegeting not only the text of Scripture, but also exegeting our immediate social location, our neighborhood, our community, our people, the prevailing cultural story of our social location. I think that this is so important. And And Tim, you talk about how important it is for us to equally be concerned about both the biblical as well as the contextual, because again, what we were saying earlier, that we are unconsciously doing this, contextualizing one way or another. And going back to what David was saying, what part of our culture do we reject as idolatry, and what point of reference do we find in our culture?
Well, what David just said, what I was trying to say before, actually, about the yes and no. To me, we never get it right, but the heart of it is you've got people who are just saying too much yes. You've got people saying too much no. I'm not talking about just a middle. I said, in every time I'm trying to reach a particular group of people, I have to say, what do I say yes to? Because if I just beat them up over everything, they're not going to hear me at all. And besides that, my understanding of the Bible and of Christianity and of common grace, and even what Peter Leithart calls middle grace, have you heard that term? Mm-hmm. The idea that in Western culture, there's still a lot of stuff that looks like it's non-Christian intuitions, but it's really a long, slow burn down of Christian thinking. It's there. There's a lot of stuff in our culture from the Bible, like loving your enemies, that does not come out of, that's not common grace moral intuition. So you have to identify something inside to say yes to, and then carefully build on that yes to the no. That's all I was trying to say. It's not just a matter of saying, well, I can affirm this, I can deny this. You have to affirm the things that you feel like on the basis of that, then I can say no to these things. And if we just slow down, I mean, by and large in my own circles, there's people who are just saying yes too quickly. They're just adopting the methods of the world. They just want to do, and they usually do it under the umbrella of saying, by all means, I'm being all things to all men, that I might win some. And I have other people who are frightened of cultural drift, and they're frightened of cultural infection, and they're just saying no to everything, and they're going back to they're actually looking at some golden era in the back, and they want to do it just that way. I actually almost feel like contextualization would be better if we all just slowed down instead of being so quick and knee-jerk. The internet does not help, by the way. It does not help because the internet is knee-jerk. Everything, it used to be you took time before something that you wanted to put out there for people to read. You know, you had peer review, you took time, you had revisions. Now you put it out there, it's there. If we just slowed down, I mean, I feel like if any denomination, if any group of Christians said, we want to do careful reflection, let's think about this, what do we say yes to, what do we say no to, and how do we build our no on what we can say yes to? And my guess is we'd all be better at it. Right now, we're just throwing bricks at each other. The people who just say yes to everything and the people who say no to everything. So actually, the yes-no thing is just a great way of thinking about what contextualization is.
I mean, I think Newbegin's point to be underlying this point, namely, until we recognize in the West that this is no longer, if it ever was, but it surely is no longer a place where the gospel is at home. That's a good thing to recognize. It is, however, often the conclusion reached is a sort of complaint culture. A hopelessness sets in, an attempt to recover an earlier era. And in that regard, being in a place like New England, being in a place like Manhattan reminds us that we are strangers in a strange land. And it's awful good to feel a sense of helplessness against the forces of the world, save that we believe in the God who is the Lord of the whole. And so the ripeness of the times is a little surprising that you have an evangelical in a place like Manhattan who appears with a kind of media presence that we would not have expected, knowing that we lost most of the culture wars over the last 30 or 40 years. It's surprising that evangelical voices are being raised against the consumer culture, which has explained what little remnant of evangelical churches there are in part, that they have become consumer churches. And yet there are voices in our time, like David's, that have issued the clarion call. And so, in part, being missionaries at home is sometimes a very good thing.
Yeah, David, you've written a lot on the weightlessness of God in our contemporary culture, primarily in North America and in Europe and parts of Australia and so on. And would you like to kind of speak into what Rick was just talking about in terms of this American paradox in a place where we have so much, we have so little? Would you like to speak into that?
Well, let me just, I'll come to your question. Let me just add a little illustration on this contextualization, because I think it's important for us to see where the yes and the no begin and end. Let me take a cultural anthropologist who goes off to a very distant country. So this place is totally foreign to this scholar. So this anthropologist is trying to figure out these people. There are three possible adaptations, contextualization, three possible adaptations this person could make. Two are necessary. One would be lethal. First, this person can adapt behaviorally. Where I grew up without electricity in Africa, we pretty much followed the rhythms of nature. People in those parts of the country, they go to bed early, they get up early. So you can make that sort of adaptation. Clothes, all of those kinds of things, the food that is eaten, that person should do. Secondly, this person can adapt empathetically. That is to say, entering into the way these people think. It doesn't mean to say that the anthropologist would agree with them, but at least understand why, for example, if it's an animist culture, why these people are just deathly afraid to walk out at night or past trees and so on. But there's one adaptation that this anthropologist cannot make. He or she cannot surrender that sense of distance that has to be preserved from that culture, without which he or she will not get the understanding that they need. If this anthropologist becomes so totally identified with these people that he or she merges into them in toto, then the research project is all over. Now, it's something like that that is at work, has to be at work in our own contextualizing. And what really preserves it is this question of the weightlessness, or rather the alternative, the weightiness of God. The problem we have in our churches, and it comes about, I think, because of our experience of the modern world, the way it's reshaped us, you have a widespread sense of the divine, but it doesn't have the capacity to wrench around our lives the way they need to be wrenched around. And what is so often missing is not the love of God, but what is so often missing is the holiness of God, which is this jarring, intrusive reality, this utter, piercing, penetrating, moral reality, which is God's character. And this glory of Christian faith, in fact, it's my subject tomorrow, is this holy hyphen love of God. And preserving that hyphen, preserving the holiness and the love of God simultaneously, unbreakably, always and at all times in our heads, because that is the reality, is really the key to God, as it were, developing some weight in our lives.
Tim, you try to state this and also demonstrate it by giving us a few examples of what David is talking about in terms of not being so immersed in a particular location where you can't objectively evaluate and to distinguish what is idolatry and what is good. And can you speak into that a little bit, this paradigm you use in terms of entering into another worldview and deconstructing it and reconstructing it? Because I think oftentimes people think that if you enter into a worldview, you're doing exactly what David was saying. You're just kind of immersing yourself and adapting to that person's worldview without making any sort of objective distinction. But could you speak into that?
Well, I really like what David just said about the fact that if you keep the holiness and the love of God together, then you've got a God with weight. You could argue that a strictly wrathful God is just a kind of a cosmic giant natural consequence machine. That if you do something wrong, he'll get you. That would also be a kind of flat view of God, and an idea of just a God of love who is everywhere. That's a flat view. But when you actually keep the holiness and love of God together, you've got a full God, a weighty God. I think you can. I like putting it that way because they. And I mentioned that to me is somewhat the key to entering a culture. When I said that shame and honor cultures have a problem with one side more, individualistic Western cultures have a problem with the other side more. You told me a story of your grandfather. This is Stevens now. Your Korean grandfather who struggled with Christianity, not like Westerners do, disliking the idea of judgment, right? He struggled much. He had no problem with hell, especially for certain people, right? He struggled a great deal about the idea of infinite forgiveness for people, no matter what they'd done.
Right.
And so I actually think part of entering the culture is you have to know which side of the weightiness of God, that you're going to have to particularly preserve. There's a danger of actually doing the opposite, and that is playing down the side that you actually most need to play up. So now you can overdo it. You can really turn God into a caricature if you're always just creating a God who's smiting people. I took a group of downtown gay women artists through the book of Jonah one night. It was a text study. I had no questions. I wasn't allowed to. I shouldn't do that. I just said, we'll read it and let's just talk about what you see. We went through the whole book, and I remember one woman who eventually became a Christian said that we were at the very end. We were trying to talk about our takeaway. What's the takeaway? And she says, "Well, I'll tell you." She says, "I've just been amazed." So why? The God of the Bible, she said, is a complex character. And she was an art critic, so she meant something by it. I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, I thought of him just as a smiter, just someone who smites people. But this isn't just a loving God." He said he's complicated because he saw this incredible compassion, but he would turn away from Nineveh. She saw that the Ninevites did not really convert; they really just got upset. And that was enough for God to hold off. And yet at the same time, he was really very hard on Jonah. And she said, this is a complex God. So she was feeling the weight. She was feeling this weight because no culture can handle the God of the Bible. You have to bring that God with his weightiness and his multi-dimensionality into their culture and sort of shock them with it. But I do think you have to be careful. There's a tendency in adapting to play down the side that the culture finds the most difficult, and actually you're losing your ability to really bite into the culture and give them something they don't have.
So one of the ways to read the questions of over or under contextualization is, does holiness in your preaching or in your ministry scare people or attract people? I think if you're under contextualizing, that is, if you don't really allow people to see how terrifyingly beautiful holiness is, you push them away. But if you're over contextualizing, that is, holiness becomes simply God really being a really good human, then in fact it doesn't cost them anything. But the Jew had this sense that their greatest fear was to see God, and their greatest hope was to see God. That's what holiness is, this sense in which you are attracted and changed. And often in ministry, it's a good thing to read. Are people simply writing you off because it's so heavy, or agreeing with everything you say because that's pretty normal? It's got to be both.
So if you're over-contextualized, you're boring. If you're under-contextualized, they don't even give you a hearing because you haven't even begun to reach out and try to find some way to talk to them. That's a great insight.
How about if we could quickly end this session and maybe take a few questions? Could you possibly give one example of what this looks like in the context of the local church in terms of ministry? To give an example, with evangelism or social justice and mercy, or with music, our preference for music. How does this kind of contextualization, how does it come into play when it affects these areas in the life of the church?
I'll give you one that's short enough that the other brothers can give it too. One of the things I remember is people most of America, they tend to assume, and in most of America it's true, that the more over 40s, the older people tend to be more religious in a community. The younger people tend to be where more of the non-Christians and secular people tend to be younger in general. And so a lot of people just think, well, what that means then, of course, is if I'm going to reach unchurched secular people in this city, I need to have my music appeal to younger people. When I got to New York, I realized that New York had gone non-religious around 1920, and that all the so-called secular postmodern people, wore coats and ties and went to the opera, and I realized that it was silly to look at what most evangelical outreach ministries to really reach postmodern people were only trying to reach young people, which might be true in big parts of the country. Maybe in Dallas, the only, no offense, that postmodern people will be younger, and most everybody over the age of 35 or 40 is relatively traditional, but that's not true in New York. And so I really, in other words, immediately I said, I do not want to turn this into a youth group with only contemporary music and that sort of thing. So we have a variety of all sorts of things, including classical music and that sort of. And it was just, that's not deep theological reflection. That's just thinking a little bit. It's stopping and thinking about who's out there. That's all. That's just one example.
Yeah, I just follow up Tim's point about music. I think pastors worry a lot about music. Most because they don't control it, but they know how significant it is in the consumer environment we are living through. And so we posed the dilemma over the last 30 years in these dreadful categories. Either we're going to do something traditional, that is, avoid speaking the vernacular to a people that needs to understand the gospel in intelligible ways, or we're going to speak through a genre of music that simply baptizes the vernacular without challenge. So the question is what style? That's the point of contextualization. The language we're using must be able to do both, must be able to say yes and no, to use David's categories. We must begin to think about the role of music in that sense, theologically, and not simply in terms of holding on to something or being relevant.
Well, let me give you a very different context. America is an enormously complex place with internet, consumerism, people flying around, more to do than we have time to do it in, time compressed, we don't belong anywhere, all of those complexities. I've been involved in Africa, building orphanages in 10 African countries. And it's very interesting just to look and see what has happened, something at least which we never anticipated. We wanted simply to pick these kids up. They are mostly the victims of AIDS and civil wars. The civil wars in Liberia, where we are, Rwanda, and we are in Jos, which you may know is the borderline between Islam and Christianity in Nigeria, and Uganda, where there is the Lord's Army, this awful operation. And we have kids in our orphanages whose parents have been killed in all those locations. Without these orphanages, all of those kids would have died. They perhaps would have survived in a little bit on the street with a couple of others, but they all would have died. So we set about then asking ourselves, beyond mere bare survival, what should we do? So we are now giving them all a Christian education. What we didn't really foresee is that in those countries, there is probably no quicker and better access to the society than by what we have done. We simply wanted to save these kids physically, but we have gained an access all through the society to the very highest levels of government. In our orphanages, we're doing Bible studies on the entire Bible. We have them at an adult level, then 5 grades down. So every single day, all through the orphanage, every child, no matter how old, and the adults will all be studying the same passage of Scripture. But what this access has done now has been to open up the public schools. So our Bible studies are now being used in some of the national public schools in some of these African countries. Now, if we hadn't contextualized in the sense that we asked ourselves, what in this society, from the point of view of mercy and justice, most needs to be addressed, we would not have that access which we do today.
It's a great illustration of what you were saying earlier in your talk, Tim, of how to relate to a culture like a situation like that where you're serving the people and therefore gaining credibility so that the Bible studies and the message of Christianity can find its way.
Yes, any kind of gospel ministry serves people. Very often they don't know that they're being served. I think what contextualization means at least finding a couple places where they see that you're serving them. That's the trying to find. You're trying to get inside. Find something that you can say. They say, this is a need of ours. You say, okay, we agree, and we'll do it together. So you do have to you have to be against the world for the world. You have to build your yeses. You have to relate your yeses and nos. There's some yeses, there's some nos, but they're not just piles of them. You need to relate the yeses to the nos. You need to show them you're serving them in order to tell them the gospel, which they may not want to hear.